Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome everyone to today's session, The Tithes of the Saints, Cultivating Leadership Donors. I will be your moderator for this session. My name is Shannon Lee, and I am the Director of Business Development for ICSC. Before we get started, I would like to begin with the conference prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Gracious and loving God, we gather in your name to draw from a wellspring of wisdom that will enrich our lives and the lives of those we serve and love. Through this networking, sharing of ideas and discernment, though, lift us up, open our eyes. Lead us into an encounter with your Son on higher ground, where we will be drawn to moments of epiphany, deeper self-awareness, and profound grace. In these times of uncertainty and stress, do not abandon us, but pour out your Spirit upon us so that its power becomes our power. Make us good stewards of what we take away from here, and inspire us to proclaim the gospel without shame, offer hope to others, and give glory to you in every word we speak and action we take. We pray this through your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our presenter for today's session is Dennis Green. Mr. Green is CEO of Church Development. He has served over 300 churches in their church capital campaigns and stewardship campaigns. He's raised over $1 billion and authored 4 books on the subject, including The Stewardship System, How to Increase Generosity in Your Church Without Fundraising. His research on the cognitive strategies of wisdom was published in the International Journal of Innovation, Education, and Research. At his home church, he is an active Eucharistic minister, RCIA sponsor, and CRHP team member. He is happily married to a theologian and has 4 thriving children. Dennis, I turn the virtual podium over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Shannon. It's great to be here at the ICSC conference. I remember going to my very first ICSC conference and just having my mind blown. There was just so much wisdom there. And I've taken so much from the conferences over the years and applied those directly to my parish. So I'm very grateful to you, Shannon, and to ICSC and to the other presenters who have shared their knowledge and life experience. So I'd like to share my life experience with you, and hopefully will help you increase the revenue to your parish and your diocese. And I'd like to bring, this workshop really has been about 30 years in the making. But if you count my life experience, that's really been 40 years. My faith journey began in 1979 when I took a float trip down the Congo River and accidentally walked into a war zone in Angola and had a gun to my head. I grew up a Catholic in Catholic schools, but it did not seem like the moment for a Hail Mary. Instead, the prayer that came out of me was, "Dear God, into your hands I commend my soul." And for some reason, those military troops did not kill me at that moment. And the second miracle that was happened as my life began this slow turn. Just thinking through what I discovered later was the stewardship prayer, which is, "Dear God, how might I be your boots on the ground?" It's from 1 Peter 4:10. We've all been blessed with something. So it's up to us to discern God's will and then have the strength to act that out. So the way I've been doing that over the past 30 years is by helping churches through their stewardship-based church capital campaigns. So I've raised a ton of money. It's how I met my wife. I've made lots of friends, and it's been a very fun career. So I'd like to share with you what I've learned. You can get these slides through the ICSC conference sites, church development's virtual booth. And the ICSC, as an institution, they have this spectacular library online that you can go to get this information, as well as a great deal of other information. For instance, I remember many years ago at an ICSC conference, I attended one of these. Of course, back then it was live and in person. And I remember it might have been Charles Zeck who talked about that one of the best practices is to budget 2% of a parish's income to devote to stewardship activity. And that was the first time I'd ever heard of a metric applied to stewardship. Now, I know what that is for capital campaigns and annual campaigns in the secular world and in planned giving, but I'm really happy to learn from such collective wisdom as gathered by ICSE for our benefit. Now, if I can help you with anything else, like I do, I give away the book that Shannon mentioned, the Stewardship System book. The subtitle is How to Increase Generosity Without Fundraising. So we've really taken a lot of research from the secular world and the corporate world and the scientific world. Like one of my favorite authors got a Nobel Prize in behavioral economics, and it applies directly to the stewardship world. And I'll weave it in today. So you don't have to read those books. I'll share with you what I have learned. So here's the agenda I proposed, and I would welcome you in the chat section to type in questions that you have, and Shannon has agreed to be a facilitator to funnel those in at the right time. So Shannon, please interrupt as we go. If anybody's got a pressing question, just click on that, and I'll attempt to cover all those. I think we got about another 40 minutes together, so please ask any question as we go. The first agenda item is I'll address, how do we create a culture of stewardship, particularly during the challenging moments of COVID, which is tough because it's been so long since we've gathered together as a faith community in my parish. And I think it's that circumstance all around the United States, if not the world. Number two is, how do we apply the 80-20 principle to the stewardship world? So in the secular world, this is a hard and fast guideline for all fundraising activities. So for us in the church world, we should examine, does it apply here? And if so, how? Number three, we're going to help you think through that question. Who are your lead donors and potential leadership donors? How do I understand who they are, which will prepare us for the meat of the agenda, item 4. How do we prepare our leadership donors to give generously? And there are 3 factors that we've discovered by collecting data over the hundreds of parish capital campaigns that we've conducted. We're kind of nerds. We keep track of everything. And for instance, when we do a feasibility study, we compare one parish's results with 100 other similar parishes. So we can really do a compare and contrast to better understand how a parish needs to go forth in conducting their church capital campaign. But these 3 factors have an enormous impact: engaging people as decision makers, engaging people as volunteers, and connecting people socially. And we can put numbers on those so that as you plan your cultivation activities, you can be very strategic in how you allocate your time and your resources. Now, in each one of these, I'll cover case studies. I brought with me numerous samples, different brochures, different campaigns. I'll put up slides and walk through what happened in each of the many capital campaigns I have worked. I've selected a couple phenomenal examples that really illustrate each of these points. We will cover just briefly a time frame on when do you start cultivating your leadership donors. And from the secular world, they consider 6 months to a year the normal time frame for cultivating a leadership donor. Now, as I look back on the past 100 parishes I've worked with, most pastors have no idea who our top 10 leadership donors are. They have no idea who the top 100 are. And I'm going to propose, I know it's radical, that a pastor does indeed discover who those people are, and then be very deliberate in cultivating those relationships, because they will be a blessing to the parish. On item 6, I'll talk about the ask. And most people feel more comfortable jumping out of an airplane than asking for a donation. So I'll walk through that ask. And we really think the best ask is based in prayer, not pressure. One of my heroes is Henry Nouwen, and this is one of his best books, The Spirituality of Fundraising. And I like it because it's really a reframing of how we think of our job as servants of the parish. And he responds to that term coined by Robert Greenleaf, I think, servant leader. That's our job, is to be a servant leader. And we're facilitators through the engagement process. And the ask should be based in prayer and not pressure. Now, item 7, believe it or not, it's real important that we follow up after somebody makes a gift. Because if they've made a leadership gift, they might be giving $20 a week for most of their life until we engage them and and lift their sights up, and maybe they make a leadership gift in the course of a year or a campaign. It's important that we follow up and ask them to include the parish in their estate as well. When we do the 1-2 ask like that, we have a very high correspondence of success on both of them. So we'll talk about how you can do that. In summary, I can break everything I'm going to say to 2 steps. A, identify your current and potential leadership donors, and then B, engage them deliberately. Generosity will follow. That's been my experience over the past 3 decades in serving churches. In the 10 years before that, I served all kinds of different nonprofit organizations from the secular world, from museums to Red Cross and YMCA. And I learned a great deal there to bring with me in my mission to serve the church world. So to begin with, this is the scripture that I hold just highest in the stewardship world. And it's kind of awesome because, believe it or not, one of the best-selling management books of all time, Good to Great, embodies this lesson. They examined 1,400 organizations that were publicly traded between the 1965 and 2000 and took the 11 top performers and found out they lived by 1 Peter 4:10. He would never say that because it was a secular book, but they operated by 3 questions. Number 1, what are we uniquely good at? Number 2, what does the world need that we can deliver? And number 3, what are our driving values? So these are deeply spiritual concerns as we are thinking through applying 1 Peter 4:10 to our lives. Well, how has God blessed me? Well, how might I uniquely bless the world? And what does the world need that I might be able to serve? And those are the core stewardship questions. Now, I'm a big fan of behavioral economics. This gentleman, Daniel Kahneman, won a Nobel Prize for helping us understand how do people think about economic decisions. And unfortunately, we human beings are not highly rational, but we are predictable. So I'm going to share with you what we have learned from behavioral economics on how you can better serve your parish. Now, I like to begin with failure analysis. So why don't people give generously to their parish? Well, unfortunately, we can measure how we're not a success. The average Catholic gives 1.2% of their income to the church. The average Protestant gives 2.1% to their church. So why that gap? And perhaps the bigger question is, why does only 5% of the population actually tithe? Isn't that interesting? Well, I have a deep debt of gratitude to Charles Eck because he really dug in to scrutinize the culture of giving in the church world. And he discovered these handful of phenomenon, which perhaps they are common sense, but where does my money go? It was not clear in the Catholic world. Where does my money go? And he used the term obfuscation, which says it's deliberately unclear. I don't know if it was deliberately unclear, but it is certainly unclear to most people what happens after I donate to the church. That isolation, that sense of disconnectedness from the individual, the donor, and the church. We Catholics apparently are the worst at asking. Apparently half of all parishes don't even have an annual campaign. We created a stewardship system that we give away to every church that asks for it to help them create and implement an annual year-round stewardship effort. So it's not just an annual campaign, but it's a year-round stewardship, education, and engagement set of activities that has weekly downloadable bulletin inserts and monthly agendas and training. So we really feel like the way we can serve the church is to elevate the stewardship professionalism and do church capital campaigns. Our real passion is stewardship, though, because that's contributing to an individual's faith journey. The bottom one, number 4, no investment in development. That's fascinating to me, how a parish might have $1 million budget and really not want to spend $100 on creating an annual campaign brochure to instruct people where your money will go. People want to be good stewards, but that's not being a good steward. It's like a farmer saying, I don't want to spend any money on buying seeds this year. That's just bananas. We've got to invest in development for the revenue to flow. So the converse, the opposite of why Catholics don't give is this book, The Stewardship System, which we put together just sharing with all the details of our many successful capital campaigns. And we found these 7 things. These elevate giving by approximately doubling. Okay. So number 1 is to begin from a values, a spiritual perspective, to embrace stewardship, that idea proposed in 1 Peter 4:10, that God has given us everything that we have. And it's really up to us to be a conduit for God's blessings. So number 1, embrace stewardship, the language and the concept. Number 2, prayer and discernment. So the decision to give should not be based in pressure. The ask should be, will you pray your way through this? Will you discern God's will in your life? That is such a different approach from fundraising. Fundraising is high pressure. Stewardship is very much a spiritual and internally directed, where the individual seeks to improve their relationship with God through discerning God's will. So the high point of our church capital campaign should be the high point of every annual stewardship campaign as well, the prayer and discernment activity. The involvement in the decision-making, we have discovered that the impact of getting input from a leadership donor into the decision-making process early on, we've discovered it's a conversion process. They no longer feel like they're spectators, but they feel like they are part of the team. So it's one thing if the pastor says, I've made a decision and you need to pony up to make this happen. And it's very different if a pastor comes to an individual and says, I'd like your opinion. We as a parish have this challenge. What advice would you give me as I think and plan my way through this? At that moment, the individual becomes part of the solution rather than a spectator. Now, number 4, this social connection, this comes from a researcher named Cultivating in his book, Persuasion. And there are 6 factors for persuasion. And he calls this particular factor social proof. So for instance, when we do a parish capital campaign, we will always list the 100 or so volunteers that were part of the capital campaign, so that virtually everybody who looks at that back panel will see 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 people that they know. And that's the proof that they need that this is okay. If my friends thinks it's the right thing, then I trust my friends, then it is the right thing. So we learn a lot from the secular world, and we learn a lot from the Protestant world too. And there's a researcher named George Barna who coined the term church shopping. And it was a horribly depressing book, because I discovered in there that people now join churches not based on theology. And my wife is a theologian, and I love her dearly. And the kids and I learn from her every single day. And she's a voracious reader, and it's really fun. She can connect today's decisions in the news going back to St. Augustine and the early fathers of the church. It's fun to be married to her. But unfortunately, Barna discovered that theology has taken a second place to social connection. People go church shopping now, and they find, where do I fit? Isn't that crazy? Think of the parish you grew up in. I mean, you had a neighborhood. If you're in the neighborhood, you go to that church. Well, apparently it is not that way anywhere now. So that social connection, we've got to respect and facilitate that. Number 5, volunteer engagement. We can put a metric, a number on this. We have discovered that when a person is an active volunteer at a parish, they will give 11 times more than somebody who's not a volunteer. So if that's all you needed to know, and your job was to cultivate your leadership donors, that one factor alone is the roadmap to dramatically increasing generosity in your parish. I'm going to identify who those prospects are, and then I'm going to ask them to volunteer, and I'm going to facilitate their volunteer experience, because that act of becoming a team member shifts their perspective entirely, and it opens the floodgates to generosity. Now, number 6, we have to ask. As a matter of fact, our research says you should ask 4 times per year. Now, let me put that in contrast with some people's perception that we need to ask 52 times per year. No, we don't. Zach, in his book, he clearly identified that we do not ask enough. Well, 4 times per year is the right amount, in my opinion. We've got to have an annual stewardship campaign. We need to have a year-end ask. Every year, it would be a good idea to have a capital ask, so people can feel like their funds are going to some concrete improvement, whether it's a new roof or an air conditioner or a van or a sump pump, that those capital asks attract a particular type of donor. And then the final one, which gets a lot of humor in our world, is the emergency ask. And the joke is you need to plan your emergency out well in advance. Okay, that's a joke. In any parish, you're going to have 10 or 20 emergencies per year. Just pick one that you share with people, because some people only respond to emergencies. Now, I'm fascinated by this whole subject. As I told you earlier, I published my research in the International Journal of Innovation, and my wife reminds me I can go 0 to boring in 2.7 seconds, but here goes. The kind of person that responds to an emergency ask has an enlarged amygdala, that is part of the brain that's very good at identifying and responding to threats. So that's not the majority of your population, but some people are most comfortable in identifying threats and reacting to them. So that's what you share with them. You share an emergency ask with them. Now, the final factor is to thank people. And the most effective thing is a handwritten note, by far, from the pastor. Most people never get thanked for anything ever. We frequently have the experience where people will write a thank you note back in response to having received a thank you note. Isn't that hilarious? But it's really important. And you can see why when you begin to think of the next time they get asked, they're going to be looking back at how was I thanked for my previous gift. So thanking now has a big impact in the future. Now, all of this, so you can get the minutes and you can get notes from this, but I've also incorporated this in the stewardship system that we give away to parishes. So if you'd like all of this and receive all of this free on a monthly basis, just give me a shout. You can subscribe. Thousands of people subscribe to this and they get it for free every month, and it helps their stewardship team. So I would give that to you if you just send a note. Now, in creating a culture of stewardship, we've got our core scripture, but what we have discovered is that the pastor is not necessarily the best educator of stewardship. We think that the best educators of stewardship are in actuality lay speakers. So we recommend that you recruit 12 lay speakers every year, and you have one speaker per month. And then when you do this, you record how much time it takes to empty out the foyer of your church after Mass, and do a stopwatch measurement the Sunday before, and do a stopwatch measurement the Sunday after you have a lay speaker speaking at the end of Mass during announcements about stewardship. Now, they're not asking for money. They're only talking about stewardship. And what we have discovered is that it usually triples the amount of time required to clean out the foyer. People want to stick around and talk, so that the human story becomes a catalyst for the strength of the fabric of the parish community. Isn't that interesting? So now, since we have COVID, we're not having, if you have Mass, maybe 1/4 of your capacity is rendered available to attendees. So we don't have the culture of interaction after Mass like we had before COVID. But in the time of COVID, we have discovered 2A, do your stewardship education by lay speakers, on video, by email. Virtually everybody has a smartphone, and the assignment is you say, okay, here are your 3 questions. You can give them a training video. I'll give you a training video if you want. You can tell them, answer these 3 questions. So the script is not the same, but the questions are same for everybody. And they can take as many takes as they want. You just tell them you've got 3 minutes max. You cannot wax eloquently for 30 minutes. I'll give you 3, answer these 3 questions, and then email that to me. And since our worship experiences are now on video, we can email it out to everybody. Or you can do, like in my parish, we do a midweek email. And our pastor, Monsignor Offit, is the most lovable chap. You could have a mental picture of him in his black clothes with the collar, or you might see him in overalls, or you might see him in a rocking chair playing the banjo. So I have come to love our Wednesday emails that are an update on parish life. It's really there. And he really does sit by a fire. They're fireside chats. It's so much fun. So you could send this out on your Wednesday video email update from your pastor, or you could send it out alone from the Stewardship Committee. After you send that out once a month, please put that video on your website under the About Us tab. That's the second most visited tab on your website. And if you've got 10 or 20 or 30 brief videos that I, a church shopper, might go to look at to better understand the nature of your parish, it would be wonderful to have so many varieties of people that I could select from to click and watch to get a better understanding of who are these people that populate that parish. Might I fit in there? Are these my kinds of people? So you can use that, and it becomes a very fun way. You know, we don't talk about evangelism as Catholics hardly ever, but this is a great way to invite people to get involved in your parish just by letting them know what you're like. Number 3, Bulletin Stories. It's important that you have a couple paragraphs every single Sunday in your bulletin about stewardship. Now, it is not asking for money. It's just presenting a stewardship story or concept or quote or activity. My favorite one by far is the story of the Sea of Galilee. And I remember when I told this to my son, he was about 3 years old. I'm tucking him in, and he said, as I'm walking out saying goodnight, he says, wait, Dad. And I turned around and I said, yes, John. I thought he'd say, I'm thirsty, but he didn't. He said, tell me about yourself. What do you do for a living? And I thought, oh, that's just so funny. He must have heard me say that to somebody for him to repeat that like a little parrot. So I said, well, John, do you know in your illustrated Bible, that place where Jesus was baptized? He said, well, sure, Jordan River. I said, great. Now, do you remember where he walked on water? He said, yeah, the Sea of Galilee. I said, now, do you know that the water flows down the Jordan River into the Sea of Galilee? Then it flows back out. Do you know where it goes? He said, I have no idea. I said, it flows into another body of water called the Dead Sea. And the Dead Sea has no outlet. It's stale and brackish and saline. There's no life in it. And it's very different from the Sea of Galilee, which is just full of life and fish, and people drink the water and bathe and they go sailing, and it's just full of life. So the big difference between those two is the Sea of Galilee, the water flows through it. The Dead Sea, the water only flows into it and it becomes stagnant and brackish. And my life mission is to help people to become more like the Sea of Galilee, where God's blessings flow through, rather than the Sea of Galilee, where God's blessings just flow in and those gifts are held tightly and not shared. Well, the story worked. He had fallen asleep, thus proving my wife's contention I can go 0 to boring in 2.7 seconds. But my son does get it, and we talk about it all the time. And that's the kind of story that would appear in your bulletin, 2 or 3 paragraphs that just help people understand that core idea that God's blessings are meant to flow through us. Now, item number 4, this prayer guide, is very important. Every annual stewardship campaign, every church capital campaign needs to have a prayer guide, because that's the high point of the entire effort. Is we want people to pray and discern their way through it. And we want to get lay volunteers to be the authors of every single page in our discernment guide. The norm is to have about 2 weeks, about 14 days, so 14 different authors. And I will never forget the best one I ever read. I just was breathless in laughter. This gentleman was just joining the church as an adult. He's going through RCIA, and he would be baptized at Easter, full immersion in this church that had a great big baptismal font, big enough for an adult to go in. And his concluding sentence was, I hope to see you all there, because when I get baptized, I'll be wearing a Speedo. Now that gave all of us a heart attack. Every reader imagining the horror of a middle-aged man in a Speedo is enough to turn you blind. Well, fortunately, he was joking. But nobody forgets those entries in those prayer guides. They remember who wrote them and what they said, and it gives everyone who's a reader to have a point of contact with the person who wrote it, something fun to talk about. So we want that. We want to build the social relationships between our people, and a prayer guide is one of those things that can do that. Now, number 5, those homilies that need to go 4 times per year really need to be directed towards discerning God's will. And I have a high trust in our pastors that they're going to be good at that. There needs to be a time of prayer and discernment in a culture of stewardship, and that should precede anytime we ask somebody for a gift. And one of the questions we get pretty regularly, what's a proven strategy for praying with donor? And this is the answer. We want a time of prayer, and we want a prayer guide, and we want the ask from the pastor to the people to be, would you please join me and pray your way through this? Isn't that interesting? So here's a story. The St. Thomas More Parish, this I think was our 3rd capital campaign with them, and it was for very boring subjects, for paint and for debt. So based on that challenge is just not exciting at all, not interesting. Things were not going to be different. It was just maintenance. So we really had to rely on something unique and wonderful. And we had to cultivate our leadership donors. So our idea was to create this prayer guide, and we gave them an assignment and some samples and outlines. And then we asked our leadership donors to become our stewardship authors. That gave us lots of opportunities for the pastor to be engaged with our leadership donors and instruct them and to socialize with them. And it was a smash hit. We had a very lovable pastor and easy to get along with and fun and interesting. Please steal this idea, okay? So who are our major donors? Now, I feel like I'm going pretty fast, and I want to check in with Shannon, our facilitator, to make sure that I am doing okay on time. And if we've got any pressing issues that we have to address, Shannon, are we doing okay?
Yes, Dennis, you're doing okay. We're about 35 minutes into it.
Okay, great. All right. So thank you, Shannon. I'll check back in every 5 or 10 minutes. But please don't hesitate to leap in and interrupt as needed. Okay, so this question, who are your major donors? There are really 2 ways for you to think about this. Number 1, examine your past giving donors, and just don't look back the past couple months, because a lot of major donors will give 1 gift per year, and they might skip a year, okay, especially since the tax laws changed a couple of years ago. They might give now and nothing for the next 2 years. So we're going to look back the last 3 years to see who your leadership donors have been. And we want them stratified by amount so that the pastor and the stewardship team can be strategic and deliberate. So that's the first path. And then the second path is to identify your potential major donors. And in this, I would recommend that you employ a firm that does wealth research, and it should not cost you much. It used to cost $1 per name, and now it is less than that. But I would run the entire parish through this. And the reason why, I'll never forget this, it was Holy Trinity Parish. And we did this exercise in advance of a parish capital campaign. And I remember this was their 4th campaign to pay down debt. And the immediate preceding campaign had raised $2 million. And we brought a stewardship approach to the capital campaign, and we raised $3.5 million. So the increase was almost 100% increase because we took this stewardship approach, which was strategic as well. So one of the tasks that we did was this wealth research to find out who our potential donors might be. And we paid an outside firm. We emailed them off an Excel list of all of our folks. They did the analysis, and they compared our list to publicly available information like college annual reports. And we discovered that one of our donors, who was about $100 per year donor to the parish, was a $100,000 per year donor to their alma mater. And when faced with this information, we were kind of curious as to why that level of generosity had not been shared with the parish. And no one could really figure out why, because they were regular attendees and volunteers. So we figured we just have not done a very good job. Well, from that point on, we did do a good job. And we invited that husband and wife to visit the pastor. We set up a series of dinner dinner events at the pastor's home just to share the long-range plan of the parish and to answer any questions that they might have. And it worked. They were very generous after that. Very simple engagement process. So your job as a stewardship servant is to item 3, make a list. Who are our top 10? Who are our top 100? That's your job. And why do I break it down like that? Because this chart is the norm. Okay. It would be normal that you would have one single donor that gives 10 to 20% of all the funds that are raised, whether it's during the annual campaign, the annual stewardship, the annual giving to your parish, or your church capital campaign. That's just the norm. And then you see the next 3 levels. Those next 3 levels of donors might be 9 or 10 people, and they might give you 40% of all the funds that were raised. So it's conceivable from your top 10 or 11 donors, you could get 50 or 60% of all the funds that are raised. Now, doesn't that kind of blow your mind? Now, in the secular world, this is not new. The 80-20 rule is called the Pareto principle. It goes back 500 years, and it's applied to business and sports and everything else. But we in the church stewardship world have not applied this. So we can, and it does indeed apply. So now I want you to imagine a typical parish that does not understand this phenomenon, and they just eliminate that top strata. Okay, that does not even come to mind. So what they have done is they have just basically ignored the potential to raise $3 million out of their total 5.4 from just 10 donors. Wouldn't that be a tragic loss? Well, it's a tragic loss I've seen hundreds and hundreds of times. So we just need to borrow a little bit from the secular world and apply this economic phenomenon to how we proceed, and it works. So your assignment is to understand who are our top 10, who are our top 100. And it would be normal for a parish to raise 80% of the funds from 20% of the donors or less. We kind of have a magic number. We think 100 is the magic number. So we think 100 donors will cover or present 80 to 90% of all the funds that are raised. Now, that's pretty pragmatic, but doggone it, it really does work. So let me tell you a story about St. Anne's. We raised 700% of annual giving. A lot of people ask us, they see our statistics and they say, how do you raise so much money? You know, they might have raised one-time annual giving in 3-year pledges or 1.2. And it's kind of normal for us to have home runs like St. Anne's, where we raise 7 times annual giving or 5 times annual giving. You can do the math in your own parish and just figure out what's our total annual budget, and you can multiply that. And what would 7 times annual giving be in your parish? And that would be kind of a normal goal that we would set in a parish. And it's because we're pretty deliberate about the identification and pursuit of the tithes of the saints. The leadership donors really can make a huge impact, and we do not put any pressure on them. We engage them and we educate them and we invite them in, and the ask is based in prayer. So we really wanted $1 million donor, and we encouraged the pastor to talk about it on a regular basis. And I'll never forget the phone call when Pastor Keith called me and he said, "Hey, Dennis, the $1 million donor came today." He said, during announcements, I made that announcement that I said, we really need $1 million donor to make this a success. And a lovely couple came up at the end of Mass and said, well, we think we might be your $1 million donor. Could we talk about that? And they were the sweetest, kindest, most thoughtful people, and they were just regular people. They weren't highfalutin. They weren't dressed like $1 million. They were clearly intelligent and professional and deeply spiritual. but not at all in need of any sort of recognition. They just had that sense of calling. And the pastor said the right thing to invite them in. So we had lots of parties in people's homes. So the next 100 donors were really pretty easy, but it was such a joy. So we need to be brave and forthright and invitational, and success is the inevitable result. So it's not random, it's not accidental, but we really do want to proceed as if we're farmers. We really want to have a tailored plan for each one of our 10 top donor prospects. So we've got to literally list them by name, and we've got to talk about how can we engage them in decision making, how can we engage them as a volunteer, and how can we connect them socially. It takes effort. We're not going to include them in everybody else. We're going to be super deliberate. And I propose that you, the servant of stewardship in your parish, be deliberate. And I would like you to invite them to get involved with the pastor. So ask the pastor, could we please set up a half a dozen events in which you and our leadership donor prospects get together? It could be breakfast, lunch, dinner, coffee over here or over there. I'll set it up. I'll do the inviting. You just have to show up, and here's your script. Say these 3 things and ask them this question. It can be that easy. And that has worked for me for decades. And we've raised hundreds of millions of dollars. So your job is to be deliberate in creating a tailored plan for your leadership donor prospects. Now, let me tell you a story about Our Lady of the Angels. This is the second campaign we did. The first one with Father Al was to build the church. And then the second one was this chapel. And so we did our research and we asked the question, what could we do systematically to engage our top donor prospects? And we knew we needed this adoration chapel. So by golly, let's create a leadership advisory board, and they will give us input on the new chapel design. And we'll meet with them every 2 or 3 weeks, and we'll invite the architect, and they'll be part and parcel of the decision-making process. And it was a smash hit. They felt like they owned it. I'll never forget the time I walked in there the first time. It was fantastic. I just felt uplifted. So how do we involve people in decision making? Since you've got your top 10 and your top 100, by far the best thing is if we could have them interacting one-on-one with the pastor. Now, I remember working at St. John Francis Regis Parish in 1996 and watching the master at work. Once a month, this pastor in announcements would say, now please stick around after Mass. I need your input. And then he would continue with announcements and close. And you know how it is. I mean, half the people bolt for the doors like the building's on fire, but the other half stayed. And he had a volunteer bringing a flip chart and another volunteer bringing a microphone here and another one bringing a microphone there. And he would present the problem. He would pull in the volunteer leader that was in charge of making a decision. I remember my first one was over the side entrance, and it was an awning. And so the pastor just introduced the subject, brought the volunteer in who presented it, and asked, well, what's your input? Do you want one that covers just the steps, or do you want something big for a drop off a car could drive under? Do you want fabric? Do you want steel? You want pillars, or do you want nothing? And just give us your feedback on what you want and what you guys think would work. And the pastor was quick to say, this is not a democracy. We've empowered these people to make a decision. They just want to know your preferences. It worked wonderfully. And then I discovered he does this once a month, no matter what. And I thought, that's why he's so popular and well loved. He's good at engaging people in decision making. Now, when we do a church capital campaign, we formalize this. We do an activity called a feasibility study, and we interview your top donor prospects, and we get a SurveyMonkey survey out to virtually everybody. So everybody owns the decisions that are made, and that's how they get that sense of ownership, not a sales pitch. I remember working with Archbishop Gregory Hartmeyer in Atlanta when he was a pastor at St. Philip Benizi Church. And he's just a delightful person. He's just a lovable guy. And he was faced with this enormous challenge of these 4 different cultures. And he's racking his brain and he's thinking, how do we pull this off? I mean, we speak 4 different languages around here. Masses, 6 masses on the weekend, and we've got 4 different languages. How do we do that? I said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have different small group events. We're going to have dialogue. We're going to have input on the building. And we had meeting after meeting after meeting, lots and lots of input. And when it was done, Archbishop Hartmeyer said, really, back then it was just Father Hartmeyer. He said, we should do this every year, whether we need the money or not. This has been a lot of fun. And it really was. It was a lot of fun. It was very uplifting. And another unusual thing was a surprise. Annual giving went up by 10%. Isn't that interesting? Annual giving goes up. And on top of that, we have all the money we raised from the church capital campaign as well. I think we raised 3 times annual giving in that church capital campaign. But for annual giving to go up to, what is that a reflection of? That's a sense of affection for their parish. And we got a out of left field gift to that campaign, which happens to us on a regular basis, because we ask everybody to get involved. Anybody who's ever visited, we're presenting that opportunity to give. Okay, number 2, we're going to engage people as volunteers. Now, I suggest that you create advisory teams for everything. Have something that is not permanent, but episodic. So we want people to be there and easy in and easy out, and in particular, people who are not all that involved. An easy thing people could do is they could host a meeting in their home. We'll bring the food in, we'll clean up afterwards. We can get a quote from them on a video or writing. They could help create a plan. They could give the pastor advice. They could serve on one of our teams. We have 6 teams when we do a capital campaign: prayer, event, thanks, youth, ambassador, and communications. So we have opportunities for everybody. And each one of those is a fun, short-term, socially engaging experience. Now, one of our best experiences was St. Paul of the Cross. We had 3 different cultures, 3 different languages, and it was kind of a bummer because they closed down their school. And what do we do with this big building, big, beautiful building? How do we repurpose it? So it started off with a real negative challenge, and then it was multiplied in complexity by the different cultures. So what we did is we had co-chairs from each of the different cultures, and we featured them together in everything, so people could see we're not separate, we are together. We had more than 100 volunteers on these different teams, so people from different cultures, ages, and duration in the parish got to know each other. Really, I'm now an old person, I realize it's not about money. It's really about our faith journey and the community that we are building that sustain us. I remember I had cancer not long ago, and the way I discovered it was a miracle. My daughter was doing a cartwheel through the dining room. I come in from the living room. She kicks me 100 miles an hour. It really hurts. I go to the doctor. He does a scan, and he says, "Well, Dennis, she kicked you in the tumor. You have a tumor. It's 10 millimeters, little tiny thing, but we need to schedule you for surgery and radiation immediately." And I think that's another proof of the hand of God in my life. It just reminds me we're all on this faith journey. And it's really not about the money. It's about the faith journey and that community of faith. And, when I was going through my 1 year of cancer surgery and radiation and recovery, I mean, boy, did my community mean a lot to me. That sustained me. That was my boat to help me float through the river of that challenge. Now we want to connect. Yes, go right ahead.
You've got about 10, 15 minutes left, and we're going to have to wrap it up.
Okay, 10 minutes until we're almost done.
Okay.
So we're going to, and please feel free to interrupt with any questions that are germane to the topic and as we go. Thank you. So we're going to connect our lead donors socially. It's very interesting. The Gallup polling a couple of years ago created the ME25 to better understand parish membership. And what we discovered that about 15% are highly involved. Matthew Kelly thinks that's only 6%, but Gallup polling thinks it's 15. About 50% of the parish is waiting to get more involved. They're ready for an entry point. And about 35%, my wife calls Christmas and Easter only. We've got to figure out a way to engage them. So the best way you can connect your leadership donors socially is in this small group cultivation activities with the pastor. And you're going to have to set up a bunch of events because people are busy. Maybe you set up 6 of them, you got to cancel 3, and you got to shift people around on when they can attend. That's your best possible method. It doesn't cost hardly anything, and it's a lot of fun as well. You can ask them to be a spokesperson for the campaign. You could ask them to answer questions. You could ask them to serve on a team. At St. Anthony of Padua, we had a really exuberant pastor. It was a restoration project. He was just so full of life. And at every step, we had input and questions, paint and plaster and location and visuals and beauty and lighting. It just gave us 100 opportunities to connect with people. And for a pastor to pick up the phone and call somebody and just do that one-on-one connecting, it's just, I'm not going to say it's magic, but boy, does it work. Now, as you're doing your cultivating and you're engaging, you're building up towards the ask, I recommend your top 10 that it's the pastor who does the ask. And we prepare a solicitation packet. It's going to have this brochure. It'll have a solicitation letter and a pledge card in it. And the pastor just has to hand it to him. And inside there, he'll pull out the prayer guide and say, please pray your way through that. So in an annual stewardship campaign, we ask people to consider giving a percentage of their income, and that, according to Zech, the percentage ask is the best way. So whether it's small, medium, or large, that percentage ask applies. So the top 10 by the pastor, the top 100 would be done with a volunteer. And it's just a personal visit. It's the please join us, pray your way through it. It's about how hard it is. We want to tell them approximately what kind of impact a gift might have. If we're building a new building, we're going to tell them it's going to be $300 per square foot to build it. And a window would be $10,000. The foyer would be $1 million. The worship space would be $3 million. And we give people a sense of where their money might go. And we ask them to pray their way through. Pray and discern God's will in your life through this. So when you're conducting a one-on-one ask with your major donors, just remember they're just like you and me. They happen to have a little bit more money. They still need to be treated with respect and gently, and pressure is never appropriate. You want to begin with asking their opinion, asking their input, and then ask them to consider. Would you pray your way through being one of our leadership donors? Would you pray and discern about the possibility of you sponsoring the education wing, to give them something to think about? But gentle is just extraordinarily important, and that's doable. And we've raised hundreds and hundreds of millions based on that approach. It does work. I remember at Holy Trinity I told you about earlier, we did these visioning dinners with the pastor and the rectory. We shared the parish needs, and it was really interesting. The pastor had just gone to the Vatican, and he brought home a bunch of really cool gifts, and he gave everybody attended a very nice little gift. And we had several spontaneous gifts of $100,000 or more, just based on that engagement. So we know that connecting with them socially, engaging them as a volunteer, engaging them in decision-making, we know that it works. It's just, we've got to be deliberate about that. So as you think about engaging your leadership donors, really today is a good day to start. Start with your top 10, figure out who are your top 10 current and top 10 potential donors are. Then move on to your top 100. Who are your top 100? Who could be your top 100? Begin today, a year out, if you're going to do a capital campaign, and 6 months out if you're going to do a stewardship campaign, to begin engaging them right away. Now, everybody would be the recipient of stewardship education, of being thanked. They would see the annual report. Everybody would hear and understand the announcements and the sermons. Everybody would receive the mail and email. Everybody would be contacted personally somehow. And we would all see that commitment Sunday and be a recipient of the follow-up. But the point I want to make with just sharing this capital campaign calendar is to just get the idea out to start right now, please, identifying Who are your top 10? Who are your top 100? And let us begin now in the engagement process. At St. James, I really enjoyed this. This was in a midtown urban parish. And our lead donor, we thought it might be appropriate that they serve as the chair of the campaign. So they were out in front of everything at all times and nonstop. And the most fun thing that happened was our top donor, which was right at about $1 million, was a former student from 60 years ago. And she was so pleased that we're fixing up the church. It was just an absolute delight. She was so happy to give the $1 million. She could have given 50 million. But the right amount for her and the right amount then was one. And it was a delight. Wonderful woman. So when you're done, make sure that you thank and follow through. We want to, your top 100 deserve a card and a note from the pastor, and everybody should get a personalized letter. And I think some kind of symbolic gift. Here's one of my favorites. This came from a church in Colorado Springs, and it was created by a steel fabricator, and he just created this beautiful little cross with a little holy card in there. Everybody got one. Everybody remembers that. Its economic value is not worth $1 million, but it's really kind of cool. Everybody loved it. Everybody got one. Everybody needs to receive the letter and the thank you note and some kind of gift. And then we're going to follow up a year later and ask them for an estate gift. And it's so funny when we follow up, we see people still have this hanging on their wall, or it's a keychain. So that the thank you sets up the planned giving solicitation as well. So we want to, after we do a parish capital campaign, we're there for 3 years and we make sure the planned giving ask happens. St. Margaret of Scotland, and we can stop after this. Well, after this one, Shannon, we can wrap it up. But I'm going to tell you the story about St. Margaret of Scotland. It's our third parish campaign over the course of 20 years. And it was remarkable because they had 3 asks at one time. They had their church capital campaign to build their new facility. They had their annual stewardship effort, and they had their diocesan campaign. We raised 3 times annual giving in the capital campaign, but then their annual giving goes up by 20% as well. It was remarkable. And on top of that, we went over goal on the diocesan campaign. And the reason why is Father Ernie was just really good at engaging. And it's really the key. If we could summarize it, it'd be down to engage your people. Don't treat them like strangers. That's the essence. The brilliant insight I can summarize: identify who they are and could be. And then number 2, engage them regularly and deliberately, and generosity will follow. All right, Shannon, that's what I got. So we've got our live booth. Come by and visit us. And even after ICSC, this information is available. That's us. You've already seen all that. But anyway, come back and join with me and the other ICSC presenters. And thank you, Shannon, so much for organizing this wonderful ICSC conference. Over to you, Shannon.
Well, thank you very much, Dennis. What an inspiring and informative presentation. I think we have time for just a couple of questions.
Okay.
On one, and I didn't want to interrupt you because you were on such a roll. There was one slide that you talked about volunteer engagement. And one of the questions was, what are some examples of volunteer engagement? And I think that we also have to talk about this in terms of where we are right now with COVID, and how do you talk about volunteer engagement when we've got where we are right now with the state of our world?
Okay, well, that's a really good question. So let me tell you a story about Our Lady of Lourdes, June 30th, end of the fiscal year campaign. COVID makes volunteer engagement very difficult, but at Our Lady of Lourdes, I'm sorry that I don't have the brochure on the screen right now, but so this was just a couple months ago in the midst of COVID, where they're not meeting, they're not having mass in person, nothing, everything's online, nobody's seeing any. Well, we still created a prayer team. we still created an ambassador team to connect with every single family in the parish. So what we did is we sent out a survey, we invited people to volunteer, and then those people that volunteered, we connected them with each other. We had Zoom meetings, we gave them assignments, we had report meetings via Zoom, and and we had an events team as well. We would have online events. Everybody would bring their favorite beverage and we would sit together on a Zoom event, and it would be social hour. And it worked. It was incredible because annual giving had a spike, a 15% increase based on that engagement activity, which was 100% digitally conducted. Isn't that remarkable? 100%. Phone, email, websites, Zoom, video is incredible. It was like $150,000 shot in the arm, and it was all done digitally. I thought that's the coolest thing ever. It's a great question. Thank you, Shannon.
That's awesome. And then I think we have time for one last question. You know, the popular thing used to be for when after some type of fundraising activity, a capital campaign, an annual campaign, is you would do a thank you dinner. You bring everyone together, you put it in a hall, the parish hall or wherever, and you did a thank you dinner. Now you can't do that right now. So what do you do in place of that?
Oh, God, I'm so happy that you asked. Okay, so I'm not a salesman, but I've discovered the software product that I love. It's called BombBomb, BOMB. It costs very little. I think I pay $30 a month, but it allows me with one click to create a customized video and email it to somebody. So literally I can click and say, hi, Shannon, Dennis here. Wish I could be there with you in person, but I just want to say thank you so much for getting involved in this activity and your generous giving. God bless you. And then I click. So I can do 2 or 3 or 4 of those per minute. And the recipient has the experience of, my goodness, this is so tailored. I've never gotten a video in the mail that said my name. That's remarkable. So we've got to go overboard. Since we can't have a dinner, we're going to have to do things like that tailored video and perhaps a gift like this one I mentioned earlier. Something where people know that they are being valued. So there's high tech. There's the thank you gift, but I think probably the best thing is the handwritten thank you note. That seems to make such a big difference. You know, this is my life, and it has been my life for decades. And I really promote those thank you cards. And yet still, I will only get a couple, 2 or 3 in the course of a year. Isn't that fascinating? So please take the time to write those personal thank you notes. Thank you, Shannon. Again, very good question.
Very good. Well, I think that wraps it up, Dennis. Thank you again. Dennis Green from Church Development. This was a wonderful presentation, lots of interesting information. And I encourage everyone to visit Dennis' booth in the virtual exhibit hall. Yep. And thank everyone for attending. And that wraps up our session for now.
Great. Thank you so much. God bless, Shannon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.